Translated with deepl.com. Disclaimer: this is an unofficial translation. Source:
Sonderzeitzeichen.
Number 2 on pages 2 to 17.
Extract from the official 720th Contact Report of 11th of May 2019.
But I came here to inform you about what I have fathomed about your private questions about the future regarding the American president, his behavior, actions and plans etc. This has also resulted in necessary possibility foresight, or prophetic foresight, which is extremely unpleasant when it may turn out to be ... and we'll fulfill it. But before I talk about it, I want to explain a few things about the behavior of President Donald Trump, whom you said he talks about like a boy who goes to grade 3 because he's really stupid and uneducated. I have personally checked this and found that your assessment of this is just as correct as your statement that he is not basically pretending to be an actor, but that his unlevelled behavior in this regard is not a strategy but stupidity and for him an insurmountable weakness. But he is deviously clever, mean and unpredictable, as well as domineering, and is able to use his uneducated speech as a perfect means of persuasion in such a way that his electorate is influenced, as you have said, by it falling into bondage to him. Hence,
excuse me, because I would like to say that all those who fall for him are, from my point of view, light-knitted, people who have no opinion of their own, who are incapable of judgment and are also stupid, and who hang on others' lips and cheer them on when they get honey smeared on their mouths by them or are lammed with lies, empty promises and cheating. This is actually the case when populism is practiced, as it is dominated by Trump and is taken in by all the unneeded who are incapable of their own thinking and decision-making. These people see the whole world and also everything that is said and talked about, as if through a picture frame, in which everything takes place and becomes imaginary effective facts, because nothing else is perceived, seen and recognized than that which is visible only through the frame, while everything outside of it remains invisible to these frame visionaries. It is as if something is observed through a telescope and only what is visible in front of the lens can be seen. And people who see everything in a picture frame or telescope look can only hear what is said and talked about in such a frame. If language is used and shaped according to the 5 hypnotism forms, namely in the context of populism, originality or original characteristic vernacular language, metaphors and in the listener's sense, then the whole thing has a plausible, suggestive indoctrinating effect on the listener, and moreover like a universal code that makes the listener helpless and willless and thus makes him or her advocate everything that the speaker or speakers say. But connected with this is the fact that understanding, reason and intellect and the intelligent are suspended, whereby all paths are opened, for example by means of negative speeches or whole negative campaigns, to denigrate opponents, enemies or any other people by means of hatred, lies, deceit and slander in public etc. and to make them impossible, only in order to want to be great and powerful oneself. This works particularly well in this way, because from childhood on, through false education, later through false self-education and combined with a religious faith, the human being of the earth creates a conservative authoritarian mentality which is very susceptible to all evil, bad, external linguistic influence as well as fear and stress. Thus a negative inner attitude is developed, which is massively shaped for one's own well-being and survival and is also violent. Consequently the factors of the brain responsible for it work neurologically better and more relevant than everything good, peaceful, loving, free, harmonious, human and all positive. The conclusion that emerges from all this, however, is wrongly judged because psychologists and cognitive scientists mistakenly assume that Trump is not simple and not stupid, but intelligent and strategic, because through his mistaken and confused speeches and actions he can create fears and enemy images among his followers and lead them populist behind the lie and deceive them. And that he thereby denigrates women, employees, dissenters, foreigners, other states, refugees and opponents, as well as all of them, with dirty insults and words. That of course impresses all those who are not needy, who hang on his lips, as well as in their stupidity do not perceive and are not able to understand which crooked mentality this Trump really is. Nor is it recognized by all his followers, because in their stupidity they are unable to assess his intentions either, that he is not only a primitive, underhanded, false-playing and domineering despot, but also a very dangerous warmonger who may be willing to maneuver mankind into another world war. And the fact that with lies and deceptions far from all truth and effective facts he only spreads his own dark fantasies without truth, as well as hatred and deliberate false information, as well as weak-minded sanctioning measures against other states, etc., cannot be comprehended by the stupid ones paying homage to him. And in their roaring stupidity they also do not notice that their Trump with its primitive speeches, accusations and false information etc. endlessly stirs around in the same mush and thus maltreats their memory in such a way. It's a matter of the time that they believe him everything and give their own minds and their own reason the go-ahead. And they will continue to do so until he has set off a war in his lunacy, which will then again cost the lives of many Americans if they have to spoon out his soup, which he has broken into with them over the years, be it in China or Persia, because he has particularly involved these two states in his hatred and his idiocy, but Russia is also involved in his sick brain. Anyway, I think the next future for the Earth and its humanity looks dark under the command of this crazy Trump, because the guy might really manage to plunge the world into an evil war. In particular, in his madness, as I have already said, he has focused his attention on China and Persia, but I think that Persia will be his first target for attack when the going gets tough.
What I wanted to explain, you just anticipated, because in fact I have arrived at the same results. And the threat of war in Persia is already clear today, because plans have long been being drawn up that are so infamously conceived that Persia is to be held responsible for alleged sabotage of merchant ships in the Gulf of Oman, in the Persian Gulf. This preparation will also include a fictitious American warning for shipping traffic to pretend Persia's perpetration of the sabotage. The relocation of the aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf is also part of the preparation of malicious and treacherous plans to bring Persia under U.S. control. The act of sabotage will actually be perpetrated next month by secret American machinations, as I have fathomed, which will then give a reason to attack Persia, and these secret fraudulent machinations and justifications, as was already the case in Iraq 2 times, due to the lies and deceit of the 2 United States presidents father and son Bush, can actually lead to the U.S. forces invading Persia. What will happen in the Persian Gulf in the near future is based on the fact that Persia is to be prevented from building nuclear weapons. As in a similar way when Iraq was attacked twice by the USA claims that Persia had already often violated the corresponding conditions of the nuclear weapons treaty, which was terminated by the USA because Persia and Russia are allied with Syria, but also in order to be able to bring Persia under U.S. control for the sake of oil, if necessary by an invasion of the armed forces. Since 1980 there have been no diplomatic relations between the USA and Persia, as they were at your time, when you were there and you also made the acquaintance of the emperor. In 1979 Persian revolutionary troops attacked the U.S. embassy in Tehran and took more than 50 hostages, for which a liberation attempt was carried out by U.S. troops, but which failed, and since then no U.S. embassy has existed in Tehran. Nevertheless, there were repeated problems between Persia and the USA, with alleged violations of the nuclear agreement on the part of Persia repeatedly being criticized, the USA denouncing the agreement and imposing new sanctions. And because Persia, for its part, announced that it would partially suspend the agreement itself, the aircraft carrier with escort ships to the Persian Gulf, and this is because the USA is striving for something politically definite and also wants to realize it, something that is quite clear and insidious, because this and the subsequent actions of the USA are also undoubtedly pursuing a very definite goal, which in the end is to bring Persia and all Arab states fully under the control and power of the USA. To this end, the USA and, in its sense, the German Chancellor, who provided aid, triggered the waves of mass refugees to Europe. And this for the sole purpose of putting the European states, which all belong to the EU dictatorship, under pressure and destroying their structures in such a way that they should ultimately join the USA in an alliance. Only Switzerland is still excluded from this, but its freedom is also endangered by treacherous and fanatical minds who flirt with the EU dictatorship and the USA. The real reason for the rise of the mass waves of refugees to Europe, provoked by the USA and Chancellor Merkel, is therefore that a new order should be created out of the whole in Europe according to the American system, in order to create a bastion against Russia and China in this way, and this as a result of the fear of the USA leaders that these two states could invade Europe together, and this bastion is to emerge from this, precisely because of the flows of refugees, sealing off all national borders throughout Europe so rigorously and impermeably that no one can enter a European country unrecognized. The reason for this is marked by an illogical confusion of fear that through a complete border blockade, through which no refugees can reach Europe, no underground fighters and right-wing extremists from Russia and China could enter Europe illegally and carry out political underground activities. All these fears, secretly cherished by the USA and the EU dictatorship, are completely illogical, childish and confused, but nevertheless for years such possible illegal agents etc. have been feared, which of course would be concealed from the public and denied if it were to become officially public. For several generations the USA has been planning in secret to build a bastion against Russia and China in Europe and to force Europe to support the US-American efforts with bigger and bigger sanctions, so that the United States of America can enforce its desired world domination, as well as all other states are to be brought under a compelling U.S. control by sanctions, and that Donald Trump, in addition, is not aware of various elements of war agitating counseling, especially by the criminal and like Trump power-obsessed hegemonic chief of defense John Robert Bolton, according to whose will he is steered like a trained animal, because of his stupidity and megalomania, just as all those who believe they can judge him that he is not stupid, but a great strategist do not believe that he is, and that these goals have been planned for a long time, even over several generations, beginning after the end of the last World War, was clearly and openly stated on October 3, 2007, even by the American General of the USA Army, W.C., who resigned from his service, when he made the following statement.
So that the plan of the United States military strategist succeeds, in the sense that the mass migration to Europe, which he demanded and arranged militarily, can be carried out to repopulate the European nations in order to make the New World Order a reality.
So that people all over the world do not look behind the scenes of the power games of the rulers, the secret services and the army. Everything is concealed to the outside world and portrayed completely unrealistic through lies, deceit and slander as well as through false representations and false reports. Accordingly, the American people believe what they should believe, as it is the case in Europe, including Switzerland, in relation to the EU dictatorship, before which Switzerland should exercise special caution with regard to the Framework Treaty, which contains manipulations for Switzerland which should drive the country into the clutches of dictatorship, but which all the know-it-alls and supporters of the treaty are unable to recognize in their stupidity and only wake up when it is too late to save anything else. It would be important for Switzerland that above all people who think clearly and rationally would take care of the affairs of the framework agreement instead of stupidity and elements which are not accountable in terms of reason, about which, however, I have already explained to you on 21st April what is necessary, which you should prepare and send to as many politicians etc. as possible.
Excerpt from the official 721st Contact Report on 14th of June 2019.
It's good that you say that, because if I had to translate these terms into German, then it would be inevitable to write long explanations for each term. But there is something that interests me now, and you said that the pledge-Aryan descendant of the early Hebrews, who was called Negrida, was, as we say, a black-skinned person. And the question whether this man then started a family and fathered offspring.
What that was the case, yes, as is clear from our traditions, but this was concealed in the extremely seriously falsified written folk history of the just as concealed as all the facts that I have mentioned. In addition, the Nicodemean doctrine brought to them was completely rejected and, to the contrary, an untrue religious history was invented, as was the history of the origin of the tribes and their descendants. The truth is that the records were not made until many decades after the real events by writers and their own interpretations, ideas and fantasies, as was the case with the Sixth Qur'an. With Muhammad, for example, it was more than 100 years after his death that the first words were written about him, and his teachings were completely disregarded and rewritten and replaced by a completely new one. So the true teaching that Muhammad brought became the RISP. Not simply falsified beyond recognition, but, as was already the case with the same doctrine of Emmanuel, it was completely denied and replaced and disseminated by a new religious history which was completely false in its truth and oriented toward a deity. In addition, over the centuries new rules, rituals, prayer, behavioral and other rules as well as religious laws etc. were invented again and again, which were unscrupulously imagined to the mad and confused invented nonsensical religious doctrine and were falsely ascribed to the chatterers Emmanuel and Muhammad.
Although I know about these facts, it certainly doesn't hurt that you mention something about them. But please, keep talking about what you have to say about your family assignment.
As I said before, this leads back to Gilkes. But I think that I have made enough remarks about this for today, and I will say something about it again later if it should be necessary.
That can really be. But what you mentioned is really interesting and goes a lot further than I had hoped to learn. But you mentioned that some of your ancestors were also religious. What was that like? And what's that like today?
At very early times, various forms of religious delusion were widespread among all peoples here in Germany, which meant that the worst degenerations and evils were as much a part of the order of the day on all our worlds as were vicious wars and terror of every conceivable kind, whereby religious wars were just as inevitable as political wars and pure hate wars, etc. All this only ended a little more than 52,000 years ago, when what I had already explained to you in a conversation came to light, namely the whole thing that happened with the moment that soothed everything evil, wrong and degenerate, etc. That's when the large metal spherical structure of each of our worlds influenced all populations by vibrations for 32 days in such a way that each individual human being became aware of his or her entire degenerated thought-feeling psychological world. Thus every single person became frighteningly aware of all the wrong and wrong, evil, repulsive and degenerate things that lurked and moderated in their character and senses and costumes, and which could erupt uncontrollably at any time by the slightest trifle, which was constantly suppressed by the religious delusion of belief, but always lurking in the background, breaking through with every possible negative move and wreaking havoc. This bitter realization led each individual human being to study the personal thought-feel-psychological world and to transform it into a positive balance according to his own discretion and free will, which, however, only became possible by dissolving the religious delusion of faith and becoming null and void. However, it took a long time until this realization was realized alone, after which it took even longer periods of time to free oneself from the delusion of faith. Ultimately, it took each individual person between 3 and 11 years, depending on their personality, to make the necessary changes, and in fact it was not easy for any man to break away from his religious beliefs, so that some people had to fight hard battles with themselves, which some could not survive to the end and therefore put an end to their own lives. As our chronicles tell us, in the end, however, all those who were strong enough were able to survive everything and to carry out and win the change through their own laborious efforts. That was more than 52,000 years ago, and since then we Plarians have been free of faith, no longer know any religions, no sects, no beliefs, and completely free of them, and this has since given us Pleiades the freedom, without delusional belief in a destiny by a deity, to determine and direct everything and everyone in every way, to move in every way in peace and harmony with one another and with one another, to communicate with one another, to work with one another and to live according to the whole in a humane manner. And this has not wanted to lose a single Pleiadian person since then and will not want to lose a single Pleiadian person in the present time and in the future, which is why our directives were worked out, which are respected and irrevocably obeyed by every single person and determine that strict must be prevented that ever again even a single person of us Pleiadians may fall into a religious delusion of faith. But if this were to become the case at some point, the consequence would be that the person in question would be excluded from our entire community and would be banished to a mankind that has degenerated according to its delusions in a foreign world, such as the earth. So it is not only the entire false and violent degenerations of all kinds of terrestrial human beings that cause us to stay away from them and not to make direct contact with them, but also the fact of their religious and sectarian delusion. This, because through these, as with us in old times, since time immemorial, wars and power struggles have also been waged on earth, acts of terrorism have been perpetrated and millions of murders have been committed, because of the religious and sectarian delusional faith, all malignancies, falsehoods, degenerations, intrigues and lecheries, up to murder and killing, which are buried in the deepest character being and as a result of an often only small trifle lurking to the outbreak and suppressed by the delusional faith, become very fast active and reach outside, in order to cause disaster. And that's exactly what you're teaching.
Yeah, cause it's nothing but the truth. But thank you for all that you have done and explained, because everything allows again a valuable insight into your Pleiadian history. But now I would like to know from you how you fundamentally judge our earthly politics. For my part, I see the whole thing in such a way that everything in the world plays completely crazy with regard to politics and is only operated by politically absolutely incompetent elements, which, with very few exceptions, are only power addicts oriented towards themselves and their own greed for power and finance, who do nothing for their own country or for the population, but only for themselves. And, as I see it, this is the case in all states, although some power-hungry people stand out particularly in this respect, such as in Germany, the USA, the EU dictatorship and France.
With this you are saying something that we are also dealing with, and I, for my part, can confirm what you have just said. Our observations and clarifications of what you have said show that in practically all governments of all earthly states, with very few exceptions, the supreme and the superiors and the elements who are absolutely incapable of acting on behalf of those responsible for the state, who have no true capacity for governance, correspond to the state. As a result, they are not able to establish a clear guideline or to make any clear and popular decisions and orders, nor are they able to carry them out. Their thoughts, actions and prescriptions are extremely inadequate and childishly illogical. All their thoughts and actions are designed solely for their exercise of power, into which, however, neither understanding nor reason are brought, because the entire majority of those in power who lead the state and the people lack the abilities to grasp effective real reality and its truth. On the one hand, however, this has the consequence that the responsible statesmen, as a result of their delusion by their obsession with power, do not recognize the effective truthful connections of the facts available to them and therefore cannot consider and process them, although they would have to. In their senses and costumes lies only their power behavior, which they have achieved through their imagination and their delusion of greatness, of giving themselves importance and of wanting to know, etc., intertwined with their religious delusion, and thereby imagine that they are handling and acting in the right way, which is absolutely the opposite. But the consequence of this is that they are neither able to perceive nor recognize existing real and true facts, because they are absolutely incapable of doing so in their childishly illogical way of thinking, never brought to adulthood, as well as in their unused mind and lack of reason. In addition, they also lack the effort to create the necessary ability and possibility to perceive the real effective reality and truth, because they can neither recognize nor rethink facts and their contents. As a result of this inability, they are not able to process something logically and reasonably, nor to achieve any logical results, nor to make and implement any valuable decisions. On the contrary, important facts are completely misunderstood and equally misjudged, resulting in absolute misunderstanding and catastrophically stupid wrong decisions, as has always been the case. In truth, today there are only very few venerable people in positions of state leadership and among politicians who are worthy of their office and who also assume their responsibility and put it into practice, and this is so, while the absolute majority of all upper and supreme active persons in the governments and in politics have no suitability whatsoever for state and political leadership, as is the case today in a particularly bad way in Germany, which is misgoverned in the front line by a chancellor who has caused a refugee catastrophe, which has already spread to the whole earth. In this regard, this person is responsible for a great deal of human misery and many deaths, for which they would be held to account, expelled from the chancellery and sent into lifetime exile. In his boundless obsession with power, this person also works underground and underhand to create a new social order that encompasses the whole of Europe. Their secret aspiration in this respect is to call up like-minded politicians and civil servants to high government offices in the spirit of building a matriarchal government throughout Europe in this way. First of all, this is to be done in accordance with its meaning via the EU dictatorship, for which it has been making efforts for some time now to infiltrate a first incompetent and power-obsessed female person into the office of EU Commission President. She also endeavors in the same way to do the same in Germany and to bring a power-obsessed female person into the Chancellery, for which she has also been thinking and devising plans for some time. And this she strives for in the sense that through her the woman is to be given a privileged matriarchal position in the state and in the family, and any patriarchy is to be forbidden. Then in relation to matriarchy, in order to preserve the female line, a strict succession and social position is to be determined by law. But what has to be said with regard to the unfitness, wrongdoers and autocratic rulers who have already been addressed, in addition to the aforementioned German rulers and their in-laws of understanding and reason who do not perceive what is really going on in the Chancellor's falsehood, the EU dictatorship as well as France and the USA, which are misgoverned by absolutely incompetent, autocratic and anti-grassroots power-obsessed and subject elements, must also be mentioned. All of these power exerters are concerned only with their own advantages, profits and prosperity, their power behavior and their high rewards, but in no way with the welfare of their peoples, for whom they would have to work to do everything good and the best for them in every respect, but for which they have no interest whatsoever. What is further to be said refers to the climate change that will be caused in the future by the accidents of the last century. The consequences of this will not only be strange, but also malignant, degenerating and people-damaging. Poisonous blossoms and many things will worsen. This happens on the one hand because, as a result of the scientific arrogance of the research commissioners, nonsensical hypotheses are created which do not correspond to any fundamentals and values, and on the other hand because the real causes are not researched and therefore it is also not recognized that these are based on the whole of the machinations caused by the mass of the overpopulation and their completely degenerated machinations. These correspond to immense life-threatening influences on nature, its fauna and flora, the atmosphere, the climate and the planet as a whole, whereby these manipulations, which can be called criminal, have an absolutely destructive and exterminating effect on everything, as a result of which thousands of many forms of life have already been irrevocably eradicated or are now threatened with extinction. And it is also these researchers who should think ahead and achieve truthful results regarding the destruction of nature, fauna, flora and atmosphere, climate and planet caused by the world's population with regard to the future. But on the one hand this is not done in any way, while on the other hand the scientists and researchers have no abilities in this respect either, because they probably carry academic titles, which however, as you always say, are only smoke and mirrors, because they do not study and fathom the effect of reality and its truth, but only empty suppositions. Therefore it is also not possible for them to use the effective facts of the whole natural environment. The aim is to explore, recognize, understand and evaluate all possible and necessary relationships in the course of the project. So it is impossible for them to gain the necessary knowledge and to calculate what is necessary for the future in order necessarily to inform and enlighten the Earth's population about the results obtained. Therefore, everything continues in the traditional way of destroying and exterminating, followed by the entire and growing overpopulation as well as nature, fauna and flora, including the planet, heading for a catastrophe that has never occurred on Earth before. You already wrote warnings as a boy in the 1940s and, with the help of your teachers Groff, Lehman and Farrer Zimmermann, who had translated everything into English, French and Italian, you sent them to numerous newspapers and radio stations, as you did in the 1950s, but this never brought about a public reaction. You have always described very precisely what is present and will continue to be the result of the overpopulation and its criminal machinations in the future, which has been emerging for decades, but your clear warning efforts of enlightenment have been ignored. Contrary, you were already from the beginning, and you are still today by know-it-alls, adversaries and other self-proclaimed people in enmity and revenge very stupidly against you, rising confused persons as do-gooders insulted, ridiculed and as deceivers and liars defamed and slandered. And this is also done especially so by the religionists who stultify their populations by lies and deceit, who indoctrinate their believers with their illusory and erroneous doctrines of faith and force them in this connection to delusion and dependence. But I digress from what I actually wanted to say. In Europe, in particular, governments will make more and more mistakes in the coming years, particularly in relation to the climate change caused by humanity on Earth, which has been set in motion by the catastrophic destructive machinations of overpopulation, which has already largely killed, ruined and devastated nature and its fauna and flora. In addition, there are the ever more violent, devastating and frequent storms, which degenerate into natural disasters, which on the one hand bring real floods and in the future will develop into ever greater and more extensive destruction of nature and will also increasingly affect human achievements and completely ruin them. And these events alternate with unusual and even many Earth people the death-bringing heat bursts, which will already rise this year in Europe against 43 degrees. Whereby from now on the increasing natural catastrophes will also increase steadily more and will bring more and more tremendous and more devastating devastations and destructions, and in the coming times worldwide will also claim more and more fatalities. This, while the planet itself will rebel more and will bring more earthquakes and seaquakes as well as volcanic eruptions, which will refer not only to known active volcanoes, but also to volcanoes etc. which have been inactive for a long time. Also, more degenerating arsonists in the forests of Europe and in other countries will indulge in their evil fanning, and also nature itself will again ignite more fires elsewhere in the world, which will become more extensive, more destructive and more devastating, as I already said in our last conversations. Also in the coming times all murder deeds in the families increase, whereby frequently all members are killed, like also many other degenerations constantly more occur, which emerge as hatred deeds from bad convictions, as by racial hatred, political extremism, religious hatred against different believers and as a result of revolts against strong acting governments. In this way, the coming times will be more malignant than ever before and will claim countless lives. And further, through unreason, obsession with power, madness, stupidity and pathologically conditioned malicious threats, terror, revenge, self-glorification and confusion of consciousness, the peace on earth, which has been fragile since time immemorial and always only time-related, is questioned again and more frequently, this especially by the United States of America and its incompetent leaders, as well as by the EU dictatorship leadership, which will be replaced and reoccupied next month by an unfit and Russia-hostile person. But now back to what I was talking about earlier. Various states of the earth keep so-called lists concerning exterminated plants, animals and getaways etc., as well as red lists of threatened animals and plants, whereby however in these lists only species known to terrestrial mankind so far are listed and of which approximately 28,000 are listed as endangered. However, the still many unknown to them are not mentioned, according to our investigations. However, these data do not correspond to the correctness, because the number of plant, animal and geological life forms endangered and threatened by extinction on Earth, as well as lizards, insects, fish, crawlers and snakes, as well as butterflies and beetles of all genera and species, which do not belong to insects, and other living creatures, is much higher than only 28,000. What we have identified to be endangered genera and species today goes up to 36,642, which includes a larger number of life forms that are not yet known to zoology, entomology, or botany. The threat of extinction and extinction of zoological, entomological and botanical genera and species, etc., continues to grow and, moreover, faster and faster, so that genera and species not only die faster and faster, but also effectively die out, as our long-term research, which we have been carrying out daily for many years, has shown. Between 70 and 180 botanical, animal, geological and entomological, as well as exame, creeping, water-dependent and other genera and species are dying out every day at the present time, and this can no longer be stopped, as a result of which the entire destruction of the species diversity of terrestrial living beings and biodiversity can no longer be halted. This would have happened at the very latest in 1975 and would have had to be implemented from this time on by a worldwide birth ban of several years and a subsequent and henceforth controlled birth regulation. Until that time, it would still have been possible to destroy all of them to this day. The aim is to stop and return to the normal course of events, which would have been possible at that time through efficient and rational action, but which is no longer the case today. But that is no longer possible today, because too much has been destroyed in nature as a whole and on the planet itself, and too many life forms have been irrevocably exterminated, and this happened by the criminal machinations of the overpopulation, namely by their need for consumer goods such as food, means of need and consumer goods etc., whereby the whole of the destructive in relation to the mass of the constantly increasing overpopulation rose more and more, and also today continues to rise uncontrolled, which could be mastered until today only by intervening destructively and eradicatively into nature, its fauna and flora and into the planets themselves, now also devastatingly affects the atmosphere and the climate. The dwindling biodiversity already threatens the earthly mankind today, which, unfortunately, is arrogant of everyone, and the Earth's population still does not want to be recognized and comprehended. Then the old and destructive style will be followed. This means, however, that through all the exploitative machinations of overpopulation, species diversity and biodiversity, the Earth and its nature and fauna and flora will continue to be exterminated and disappear, which will ultimately threaten and question the survival of all life and that of the entire planet. As a result of stupidity and irresponsibility, the majority of terrestrial men pretend through ignorance and unreason that when a single grass or herb, a tiny animal or insect, etc., a single grass or herb, a tiny animal or insect, etc., the majority of the Earth people are not able to understand the truth, which is of absolutely no importance, because personal food is not affected and nothing goes away from life, which is why it does not matter if something small dies out. No thought is wasted on the fact that the extinction and disappearance of even a single plant species or a single small animal accelerates the death of insects and the extinction of another species. Basically, the majority of terrestrial people do not worry about nature, its fauna, flora, atmosphere and climate, but simply live senselessly into the day, as you say again and again in our private conversations. So no thought is given to the fact that bees and other insects are very important pollinators of flowers and many foods, which make up 1/3 of the natural food of terrestrial mankind. The extinction of several of these insect species has already had negative consequences in terms of the production of various natural foods, which has resulted in famines in countries that have been negatively affected for decades, and many people are dying of hunger and agony. The really exceedingly bad consequences that will result in the future from the continual extinction of species. That is why the overpopulated earthly mankind does not think about it. Consequently, the terrible consequences that are already looming are also not foreseeable for them, but that will change in the future for the descendants of today's, tomorrow's and the day after tomorrow's irresponsible humanity on earth, because it will be these who will experience and feel the evil consequences in the future and will curse their ancestors and their irresponsibility for it. However, it is not only the clarity regarding the extinction of many different genera and species that is clear today, but in the future there will also be many more and other animals, plants as well as many animals, insects and diverse other life forms, which will also be threatened by extinction in the future. But the Earth people do not care about that at the present time because they still cannot measure at all which tremendously terrible consequences the extinction of the respective further types and species will entail, and only the overpopulation with all its destructive machinations, which is enormous and not bearable for the planet Earth, will be to blame for this, as it is also the case today for everything that has already happened in this respect with regard to the various exterminations of different genera and species of natural biodiversity. This is because it does not want to be recognized that the overpopulation and all its activities that destroy nature, fauna, flora, the atmosphere and the climate are to blame for everything. And it does not want to be recognized and not acted in such a way that only by a drastic worldwide and perennial birth stop and an equally drastic worldwide birth control the worst still prevents and thereby a regeneration of the still salvageable could take place. However, regenerating what is still salvageable in terms of nature, fauna and flora, the planet itself and the atmosphere and climate would take a very long time, over many generations. But what is now being done irresponsibly is that a teenage and ignorant child named Greta Thunberg is being shamefully abused to lead a global climate protection movement. This is despite the fact that this innocent child has no idea or knowledge of the actual extermination and destruction connections with respect to nature, fauna, flora and the planet, climate, etc. In addition, the ignorant child, who since his first appearance in the meantime has fallen into a delusion of self-upliftment, is afflicted by a weakened autism, through which he has a weakness regarding social interaction and also regarding communication. Further disturbances are also present in this child in the way that it is controlled by habits and customs and does not show any expression of empathy, as I could clearly diagnose. Also, as a result of a delayed development of consciousness, it is not able to perceive reality and its truth in a correct and rational way, which is why it tends to deal intellectually with individual factors of something without being able to grasp their fundamental factors in their reality. Consequently, it cannot do due to the lack of the ability to perceive motion with regard to any life forms of nature and humans. The child is also marked by a severely inadequate social incapacity, as sporadically by a lack of attention, although it is driven by a strong inner pathological compulsion in its climate protest. Climate change, which was first denounced by an ignorant child and since then has made waves in governments all over the world and has also caused the masses of unneeded climate protesters who, just like the child, have no idea and knowledge of what is really a fact, means that governments and politicians will start to exploit the whole thing in a populist and also in a way to fill their coffers. This will be done by the irresponsible rulers and politicians inventing and implementing new compulsory levies and taxes which then correspond to nothing more than a financial exploitation of the populations in order to stuff up the state coffers in this illegal way, but whose finances are again uselessly squandered and, in addition, made into debt. What I now have to say, however, corresponds to facts that do not really correspond to the nature of what I want to talk about, because it does not correspond to my need to interfere in the erroneous and confused, false, stupid and illogical governmental leadership machinations as well as the modes of action and behavior of earthly governments and politics. Nonetheless, I see a need to do so today and to say that the absolute majority of earthly rulers and politicians can be judged as grown up according to their physical maturity, but not in terms of their consciousness adulthood. In this respect the absolute majority, however old it may be in each individual case in terms of years of life, lives in an unadulterated, childlike state with regard to its intellect and its reason. In this state, however, it lacks the ability to judge, decide, act, behave and take responsibility, making it incapable of leading populations and peoples. And this inability, as well as his selfishness and cowardice for recognition in relation to reality and truth, and fear of public opinion, etc., means that he has no thoughts whatsoever to look truth openly in the eye and recognize that reality is different from what he claims to know it. So it is not a question of reality and its truth, nor of what must necessarily be recognized and taught in relation to the real causes of atmospheric degradation, climate degradation, the threat to all life and the destruction of nature and the planet itself. This applies equally to the extinction of the biodiversity of the entire flora, as well as to the existence of the ever-increasing threat to fauna, in which more and more genera and species of various life forms are dying out as a result of the Earth's human guilt, and that the whole thing in all misery and evil, in destruction, death and extermination etc. is only caused by the guilt of mankind on Earth, namely by the enormous overpopulation, from which all life is questioned by their machinations, that does not concern the highest and highest world leaders, and is the action of the further growth of the overpopulation not stopped by a worldwide and perennial birth stop, and afterwards a worldwide birth control is decided and carried out, which already had to be done in 1975 at the latest, which however was not done. Then the exterminations and destructions will continue, and finally an unstoppable destruction of the whole existence of the Earth and all its life forms of all kinds and species will lead to the bitter end. Secret plans are already being devised to underhandedly exploit the peoples with new taxes, such as premiums for alleged climate protection, as well as tax collections for the emission of all kinds of emissions. In this regard, the use of today's technology will be considered in order to force new taxes and other levies on the populations, which often have to perform their daily work very laboriously for low wages and have to live in meagerness, while the rulers live in a frenzy by the tax money laboriously earned by the workforce and are exempted from the new taxes and levies. In fact, the first attempts are already being made to exploit the populations with new taxes and duties by financially robbing the heating systems, sports, transport and means of transport, working machines, ships and airplanes, as well as various other things that still generate large amounts of emissions today, of their emissions. The reason for this is that there are still no really effective and other and better ways of producing and using other vehicles, heating systems, aircraft, ships and machines etc. that are free of carbon dioxide and other emissions. The recently popular electric vehicles are not a solution either, which are propagated in order to reduce harmful and climate-damaging emissions, because on the one hand this thoughtless, erroneous and confused propaganda leads to a production mania and on the other hand to a hostility, which is still visible today, of that large part of the peoples, which has fallen into the climate protection mania and will continue to do so, which Greta Thunberg conjured up and which has now also penetrated into the governments and from now on is also supposed to serve for the financial exploitation of the populations. As far as the fact of the effective origin of climate destruction is concerned, this cannot be recognized and understood by the child Greta Thunberg, nor can it be understood by all the worldwide masses, who carry out climate demonstrations with stupid, imprudent and naive screams of pros and cons and make nonsensical demands which are addressed to the populist rulers and politicians, who feel threatened and have reached their positions, who are wrongly governing, who are now reaching out to the climate demonstration mob and whose nonsensical demands are to be met. And these, as you always say, these are the ones who, precisely for this reason, are setting their banners after the climate demonstrators' climate demonstrations and, as you just said, whine along with them. The whole of this governmental machination or the whining of the governments and all other offices, organizations and climate protectors is only vain appearance and deception, as well as their useless suggestions and resolutions of each façon, And this is the case because the only solution is to bring humanity on Earth to a planet-compatible population and to maintain it by means of a long-term birth ban and then a permanent and controlled birth control system. Only in this way can the degenerations, destructions, annihilations and exterminations of all kinds be stopped by the criminal machinations of the overpopulation and, in the course of a very long time, under certain circumstances and efforts, some things in nature and on the planet itself can be partially calmed down and halfway normalized again. To a large extent, this is no longer possible and can no longer be realized, because far too much has already been destroyed and exterminated in nature, fauna and flora, and also the planet itself has been irresponsibly and criminally exploited in terms of its resources, following which it has become useless for a long time for a mankind of a distant future seen already today. This fact already shows today that a further survival of humanity on Earth in the more distant future can only take place if a far-reaching immigration of mankind or humanity resettlement to a new, very distant and not yet destroyed planet would take place. This, however, would correspond no more than to a very uncertain hope, if it could be taken into consideration. Also because possibly foreign planetary peoples would not be willing to immigrate or let immigrate into their solar and planetary systems a humanity that has degenerated ethically and morally in such a way, like humanity on Earth, whose great majority is in a bad mood. But once again I digress from what I want to say fundamentally about climate change and the absurd, inappropriate and stupid demands of climate monsters and governments. An effective climate change can no longer be achieved in a short term, as I have already mentioned, and consequently corresponding ideas, wishes, aspirations and proposals etc. are nonsensical and therefore completely illogical and not designed to stop births worldwide and thus not to stop and end all destructive and exterminating machinations concerning the exuberant needs of the overpopulation. All the requirements that the emission of harmful emissions, in particular carbon dioxide, should be limited, such as for vehicles of all kinds, for aircraft, ships, working machines and heaters, etc., or that these are mainly prohibited and that all such equipment, machines, vehicles as well as means of transport etc. are to be rebuilt, renewed and replaced by electrification, cannot be more illusory. Of course, such measures, this is undeniable, could limit certain emissions somewhat, but this would not be more than a drop in the ocean, as you say comparatively with regard to certain things that are useless when they are done. The fact is that, even with a small reduction in all harmful emissions, the whole of the atmospheric impact of a project can be reduced to a minimum. The climate, the planet and its nature as well as its fauna and flora would not change anything. The reason for this is that the massive overpopulation on Earth continues to increase excessively and no worldwide halt to births necessary for several years and a subsequent birth regulation is implemented in reality. Through the further growth of the overpopulation and the planetary and life-destroying machinations that increase with every new birth of an earthly man, all the demands of the naive child Greta Thunberg and her equally ignorant, naive, attached to him and stupidly to be called climate monstrance become ridiculous. This also includes the actions of the rulers and politicians, who also ridicule themselves in their stupidity, which could amuse the peoples if the whole evil were not so serious, because even the highest of the state leaders do not perceive and therefore do not understand what the need really requires, and this requirement, namely a ban on birth for several years and then a comprehensive birth control, is unavoidable in order to reduce humanity on Earth in a reasonable and humane way in the foreseeable future. But this is not taken into consideration and rejected by humanity on Earth, because it wants to maintain and not contain its criminal machinations for its life needs, its well-being, its food and luxury goods as well as its holiday and travel addiction, but only by doing what is necessary. All life and all existence can be protected and preserved, just only then when the overpopulation threatening all life and all existence with all its endangering machinations is contained. This is the only way to gradually recover and regenerate over centuries what has not yet been destroyed and eradicated in the biodiversity of the entire biodiversity and on the planet itself.
Thank you. Long speech, long sense. For what I think, it is good that you said something like that once, and not just me. I find this particularly good, because each person must represent his own personal opinion, but also that everyone has to respect the opinion of another. And I act exactly in this way, therefore I value and respect every opinion of a person as his right, no matter what kind it is and how it is held, as long as it is not criminal and therefore not against the body, life and safety of people or torturous etc. with regard to any other form of life. Thus every human being has in principle the right to his own opinion, and this also applies to every religious, philosophical, ideological, secular or other faith, no matter how mad or insane. But he must not be not criminal or degenerate against life and limb. From this point of view, I leave every human being with his opinion as he is, which is why I never harass a religious believer or attack his delusion, unless he does the opposite and attacks me. In principle, however, I leave every human being as he is, thinks and believes. Therefore I accept him as a human being as he is as a human being with his opinion, and therefore I follow him as such by giving him the necessary honor and dignity and not condemning him, but I can show him that this is stupidity if he thinks, acts wrongly or behaves wrongly, which brings harm to him or other people.
It has long urged me to say something myself in the way I did. And what you have now explained regarding your behavior regarding your acceptance of other people's opinions, I know very well that this is really your impeccable way.
But now it's done, and it's probably good and right. But I would also like to say something about this, namely that the climate cries of all kinds, including those of climate protection organizations, as well as those who are now leading their big mouths in governments and politics, do not want to hear about the truth of the real cause of climate destruction. The reason for this is quite clearly that we do not want to think about the fact that the overpopulation with its destructive machinations of all kinds is to blame for everything, as well as the fact that the last evil can only be prevented by a birth ban of many years and birth control. Now it is probably more than only 7 years in relation to a birth stop, because the mass of mankind has increased enormously since then. When the 7 years were announced, the majority of the people on Earth are simply unteachable and so selfish, self-referral and unscrupulous towards the Earth, nature, its fauna, flora, atmosphere and the climate that makes it howl, and this majority is also absolutely indifferent to the entire earthly existence and all life in general, which is why it stubbornly refuses to even think for a moment about the fact that the emission of offspring creation also belongs to the entire existence and all life forms on Earth. This stubbornness, indifference and also the irresponsibility are not connected with it and have effectively nothing to do with the fact that one's own free opinion is formed and represented, but only with the fact that under all circumstances the personal egoism is set above everything and against all reason and responsibility is forced and enforced by bending and breaking. Something else, I think, is the fact that humanity on Earth must be divided into 6 categories, resulting in the following. First of all, it is no longer possible today for the majority of Earthlings to have a correct and interesting as well as binding and valuable communication. Secondly, Nowadays the majority of mankind no longer cultivates any valuable interpersonal relationships, and as a result human cohesion in general has already atrophied to such an extent and continues to atrophy to such an extent that not even genuine connecting acquaintances, let alone honest and connecting friendships, can come about. Thirdly, the majority of mankind today is completely passive with regard to really valuable and value-stable interests and activities and is becoming more and more atrophied in consciousness and reason, no longer forms its intellect and its intelligence, but trots more and more by the brainless use of the ever newer technical and electronic achievements, which drives consciousness to dullness. Fourthly, the majority of mankind today is so dull that it is no longer capable of forming its own opinions, but only falls into bondage when, through suggestively populist slogans, lies, promises and slander, it is subjected to delusions imposed on it by politicians, rulers, clergymen, preachers, sect chiefs or secret allies, etc., and lets itself be lulled to their will and opinion. Fifthly, the majority of mankind today is completely indifferent to its fellow human beings, to nature and its fauna and flora, and to effective reality and its truth. Sixthly, only a very small part of mankind today is interested in the effective reality and truth of all things, as in relation to the entire existence of all that exists in every way, all that is planetary as well as universal and all that is creatively given in every respect, that at all only its own rational and responsible opinion is formed and represented. Effectively it is the case that the overwhelming majority of the earthly being uses neither intellect nor reason and therefore goes along dull and blind in sheer stupidity, is interested in nothing at all, but only for its own well-being, enough money and the necessary needs to be able to exist at all.
Your words in the earthly ear, for there they belong.
Which if you're right, so is it. But to talk about it further is of no use anyway, which is why it is probably better if I ask you something that interests me. Basically, there is nothing left on Earth in the wild and its fauna and flora that is not contaminated by any pesticides, etc., etc., not by the natural toxins that are produced in the wild, but by artificial toxins of all kinds produced by the earthlings. Already your father's Firth explained to me in the middle of the 1940s that all toxins of all kinds, respectively from bacteria, plants or animals, fishes, snakes, insects, snakes and from animals etc., which originate in the free nature or from organic poisons separated or from the decay of bacteria, no matter which, do not occur in excessive quantities and are also not necessarily deadly, like deadly poisons produced by the earthlings. He also said that these toxins will be present in all naturally planted foods in the next few years, as well as in groundwater and thus in the human food cycle. This would be scientifically verifiable from the 1950s onwards and would also be scientifically recognized. The results of the research in this area would, however, be kept secret from the public by the scientists responsible and the authorities, although the Federal Office of Public Health was also concerned with it, which, if I remember correctly, was transformed into a Federal Office of Public Health in the 1960s or so, after which it was renamed again in the 1980s and briefly referred to as the FOF. Today it is a question that belongs to the Department of Home Affairs and is responsible for national health policy and, in this regard, for promoting the health of the Swiss population. It should not be overlooked, however, that this office did not prohibit the entire application of poison, but rather claimed, to the contrary, that certain very small quantities are harmless and tolerable to the human organism. And that is contrary to what you have often explained, like your father's Firth, that poisons of any kind, even the smallest amount in the range of a single microgram, are just as harmful to the health of the entire human organism as they are to all forms of life. Ansforth explained, as you also said, that the fact is that such minimal traces of poison would in the future cause many kinds of ailments in humans, which would not exist without these toxins in the organism. This means that even the slightest traces of the poison result in new suffering, damage and pain, which were previously non-existent or negligible, but which have become prevalent since the introduction and spread of the poisons, which continue to drive existing ones forward and cause new suffering.
This is indeed the case, but it should also be mentioned that since the mid-1960s groundwater has also been contaminated by the many poisons that have been irresponsibly spread throughout nature and flora, and that these substances also enter the human organism as poison-bearing drinking water, as well as by the finest poison particles that float in the air that breathes in the atmosphere and enter the lungs as a result of inhalation, and thus into the blood and the entire organism.
That's probably the case, and you must know it much better than our scientists, who, in contrast to your much more advanced knowledge and experience, crawl out of their caves practically only slowly and see the first blades of grass, in which they perceive their rough external structure, which they cannot yet explain, and recognize the first details. If, since the 1940s, we look at what has been achieved so far with regard to the application of poisons in nature, then what Ansforth said proves to be reality today. For in the meantime his predictions have long since become fact and truth, namely that the release of artificial toxins into nature in the future, seen from the second half of the 19th century and the present and future times, will cause deformations and other changes to the body extremities of humans, as well as damage to the health of fauna and flora. This is the case, as I have already said, with the application and use of quantities which are generally harmful, which is a relative fact. Ansforth also explained at the time that these artificial toxins would also cause severe negative changes in people's brains and affect their consciousness, which could lead to stupefaction. But it was also the case, as he particularly mentioned at that time, that the effects of artificial toxins, which contaminate everything, caused the majority of mankind to suffer from severe and also many and sometimes incurable diseases, as well as such changes in consciousness and severe damage to consciousness, which impaired man's use of reason and in some cases made them completely impossible. He explained, as I remember very well, that this would cause many people to lose consciousness and become extremely vulnerable to illogical thinking, acting, and addictions, and that it would also severely impair, weaken, and manipulate people's own ability to think and make decisions through outside controlled influences. Now, I have thought about all that Ansforth has explained to me in this regard on various occasions and have come to the conclusion that the explanation for this can probably be that the damage to consciousness and changes in consciousness caused by the poisons and the impairment of mind and reason caused by the poisons, as your father predicted, correspond to what you already noticed a few years ago and said that you did not notice any progress in consciousness in the majority of terrestrial human beings, but to atrophy of consciousness. If I bear this in mind, then it must be the case that in the majority of the earthlings, the already not very highly developed intelligence is constantly diminishing in terms of its level, or rather that being intelligent as a result of the non-use of understanding and reason is becoming more and more atrophied. And in my opinion, this can only happen if the intellect is no longer formed as a result of the absence and non-exercise of the necessary work of reason. But I can imagine this very well with people who have fallen for religious delusions as well as ideologies, dubious philosophies and some other beliefs, eroded false teachings as well as false information, false views and all misleadings and confusions. This just as the majority of the people of this world are affected by such influences and in this way are suggestively influenced and indoctrinated by other people and become a belief of some kind and believe that they have now found and won the non plus ultra of all wisdom, but in reality have fallen into a confused deception. And this happens because these people do not turn to the effective reality and its only truth and do not seek the truth in themselves in a completely neutral way by freeing themselves from every faith and external influence and learning to be themselves and to trust only themselves. But this means that man, however and whatever he may be, will not be afraid of anybody. Everything that is brought to him is considered, fathomed, processed and made into his very own knowledge. He must not let others decide anything about learning and the search for truth, but this must be left to him alone in every respect, for he alone is himself and may and can only decide about himself, but never another human being. Our faith, however, corresponds in each individual case to an external suggestive and indoctrinating influence and forces the human being to believe in something that is embedded in him, whereby he inevitably loses in every respect his independence of his personal search, as well as his own knowledge of values, his personal search for the truth and its finding. Through faith man loses in every way his independence, autonomy and self-recognition, as well as his personal freedom of decision and decision-making ability, whereby he inevitably becomes a slave of his faith, from which he can then no longer free himself or only very laboriously and with difficulty, if at all. But what interests me is what your great-great-great-grandfather actually did here on earth. You once mentioned him briefly in a private conversation, but I forgot his name.
My great-great-great-great-grandfather was called Isabran, and the meaning of the name is he was an expert in languages and writing and came to Earth with many of his students at the time of the Mediterranean pre-Asian civilizations. He settled in the area that was then called Egypt and continues to exist to this day, but he traveled far and wide, including the country that is now called Greece. According to his knowledge, he was always anxious to spread the art of writing and languages, which he also tried to do around the Mediterranean among the various peoples who accepted his teachings and learned writing, depending on the people and language. He taught them various forms of writing, from pure pictorial writing to the graphic design of typefaces in various languages. In the same way did all his disciples of both sexes, who spread all over the world and who at that time did not yet teach very large nations in writing and language. And when I speak of peoples, I do not mean the peoples themselves, but only those of them who also at that time strove for a higher education and for more knowledge etc. than the majority of the peoples had.
Thus your great-great-great-great-grandfather was on earth at that time and taught the early peoples the scripture, as did his disciples worldwide, so one can say that actually all the early scriptural languages used on earth lead back to a pledge-Aryan origin with the earthly peoples.
You could say that, yeah. In the course of time, these original fonts have of course been changed in their form again and again or put out of use, which is why many of the original fonts only exist as historical remnants, if at all. But what has to be said about this is the fact that unfortunately the written language was abused very early on by those who knew the scriptures on earth. This was done in particular by persons who were familiar with writing, who recorded historical events in writing, but who interpreted them inadequately and completely wrongly according to their own and inaccurate observations, as well as very often deceiving perceptions and imaginations, inadequate memories and assumptions. This was also the case when the writer was engaged and committed by people for written records, whereby it was without exception the case that those capable of writing and thus of writing never wrote down exactly what was assigned to them for writing. As a result, It was always the case that those people who claimed the knowledge of Scripture, because they themselves were ignorant of Scripture and therefore also of the written language, could do nothing other than present their concerns to be recorded in writing, etc., orally to the people who knew Scripture in their simple language. The writers then allowed themselves to record in writing what was explained and said to them through their own interpretations according to their own understanding and interpretations, and this was because the uninformed people who commissioned something to be written were not able to dictate directly in the written language what they had to say and explain. Therefore, in all the old written traditions, misdescriptions and sometimes extremely serious misinterpretations arose as a result of the writer's own interpretations, which have survived to the present day and are taught in equally incorrect forms. Likewise, this happened at all times with regard to all religious written records, for only one, and not one else, of those persons to whom the written traditions are ascribed were knowledgeable of Scripture and the written language, so that they had all their statements written down by those knowledgeable of Scripture and the written language, who formulated everything according to their own writing abilities and also wrote them down by their own interpretations and suppositions, etc. This was also the case with all large and small religions and their sects, thus also Islam and Christianity. Just as Jmanuel's whole life story from birth to death, after his flight from Jerusalem, was spread with monstrous falsifications, lies, assertions and slander, and later also written down, so the same happened with Muhammad, whose real name was Abdul Qasim Muhammad ibn Abdallah. With Jmanuel only Judas Iscarioth was familiar with the writing, but neither a female nor a male member of his discipleship, which comprised more persons than only the 12, which are listed in the New Testament, which is full of inventions, falsifications, false recollections, interpretations and lies. In addition, the individual sections, assertions and etc. of this work of lies only many years after his flight by writers and moreover further falsifying by their own additional interpretations composed and partly also ascribed to former disciples, who however never participated in such writings and thus did not give any information about that, from which then the work of lies New Testament originated. In addition you have given the various necessary data and explanations for the correcting also, by which he did pertinent investigations, how he found out however also much of the actual truth and could hold these also in writing. But I have to say that it is unfortunate that you and Guido had to promise him not to mention his name and his writing during his lifetime, which shows extraordinarily good facts. Unfortunately, however, the man also conceals those of your statements made to him, which should actually be mentioned openly with regard to the entire origin of Jmanuel's story. If the life story of Muhammad is examined, then it must also be said here that there is hardly a true word in everything that is supposedly transmitted about him, for just as with Jmanuel, no one was familiar with Scripture in written language except his first wife, the widow Chidizka. She was a member of the highly respected Quraysh tribe and heiress of a caravanserai and a trading business in Mecca. First Muhammad did various works for her under her matriarchy, before they got together and married, after which she appointed him a business partner. The woman was devoted to Muhammad with sincere love and was also able to connect with his teaching, which she greatly appreciated, but she did not write down a single word of his teaching or of his life. The incredibly infamous slander that Muhammad is said to have fathered several children with this woman is a lie of an unparalleled kind, because the woman was incapable of conception and could therefore not be impregnated by Muhammad, since Chidizka wanted to have children. However, it was decided in agreement between her and Muhammad to accept several orphans and to secretly pretend that they were their own. When his wife died, he married as his second wife Sauda bin Zama, with whom, however, he also did not father any descendants, nor with Aika bint Abi Bakr, who was his third wife and who, Contrary to the slanderous traditions at marriage neither 6 nor 7 or 9 years old, but was 19 years old, and the malicious slander story against her, which is said to have been told during the campaign against Banuel Muslik in the year 627, is just as much a malicious lie as the story of the 12 who were built on old but 19 years old, and the malicious slander story against them, which is said to have arisen during the campaign against Banuel Muslik in the year 627, also corresponds to a malicious lie, as does the story of the 12 nothing more than lies and deceit. This applies equally to the many lies that Muhammad, in addition to his regular marriage, married a larger number of women and had slaves as concubines, for in fact it was only the 3 wives Chiditska, Sauda bin Zama and Ika bint Abi Bakr, whom he had married after the death of Chiditska, whereby these married alliances also remained childless, for even with these 2 women he had no sense of begetting descendants. The whole greater number of other women who were around him were in no way in any marital relationship with him, nor in any slavish or concubine relationship, but all were well protected in his care and friendship. So long after his death other women were imputed to him by lies and slander of alleged relatives and chroniclers etc. and had no truth at all. This also applies to the veiling of women, as well as to completely different nonsense. Malicious-minded people who were against the spread of early false Christianity, which had emerged centuries before and which completely falsified the true teachings of the preacher Emmanuel, saw in it an opportunity to falsify Muhammad's teachings as well. So at his time they seized the opportunity to falsify his teaching, which was the same as that of Emmanuel, and to spread rules and regulations just as it was with regard to the teaching of Emmanuel. Just as Emmanuel was not able to defend himself against it, so Muhammad's case was as well, for when both had gone their last way, their always identical teaching was abysmally falsified and new religions were created from it. As a result, the faithful turned to the new teachings, which Muhammad and Emmanuel were no longer able to oppose as a result of their departure, and consequently Christianity with the truthful and Islam with the truthful completely repressed. Ancient Palestine was occupied by the Romans at the time of Emmanuel and had experienced some upsurge under these, but the native population was directed by a harsh Jewish and religious rule, so it was up to the emerging Christians to devise a story of lies of the resurrection of crucified Emmanuel and call him Jesus. This, while southern Arabia was a very backward area at the time of Muhammad, far away from all the cultural and economic centers of the world at that time, where the people who were poor suffered great hardship and only gladly believed and fell in love with a new religion of salvation. If the old writings are inspected, which are supposed to come from disciples, fellow runners and the like, as well as from direct or indirect descendants, relatives or from family members of the two Kundar, then all such alleged writing proofs correspond altogether only to sneaky falsifications, false memories and false renditions as well as very wrong interpretations of the scribes. Truthfully, there is not a single such ancient document that would be directly or semi-directly related to a person who has been in direct or indirect contact with Emmanuel or Muhammad. Claims to the contrary and to so-called are nothing more than forgeries and lies, for both Emmanuel and Muhammad's first written records were only made years later after their departure or death, and this happened according to very deficient or erroneous memories, but also through deliberate false assertions and lies etc., as a result of which glorifications and fairy tales also arose in relation to Emmanuel and Muhammad. In addition, various direct and indirect followers were falsely ascribed to the two announcers, who in reality had nothing to do with them. Even disciples, followers and relatives who knew how to write, as well as friends, etc., were ascribed at all times to the two preachers Emmanuel and Muhammad, but not a single one of the aforementioned was familiar with scripture and writing. The only one among them was Judas Iscariote, who mastered the scriptures correctly and truthfully and was knowledgeable of writing and a disciple of Gamaliel. Later he was slandered by falsifiers and followers, just as Gamaliel the Nami Jesus was also accused of. So it must be made clear repeatedly that with Muhammad and Gamaliel everything was equal. Although with Gamaliel Judas Iscarioth was familiar with scripture and the written language and made the records, from which then through your and the group members' efforts the Talmud emerged, which finally had to be translated and revised correctly by our people familiar with scripture and language, because the priest Isa Rashid had translated it incorrectly according to his Christian delusion. This, while all other records relating to the teachings of Gamaliel and Muhammad were in no way made by any of their disciples or direct or indirect descendants, etc., but by strangers, even long after their death. Truth has been established in relation to both in their teachings, which on both sides are the boot. Everything was abysmally misunderstood and boundlessly falsified beyond recognition. This also applies to various other old writings found old and new, which likewise do not lead back to any disciples during the lifetime of Gamaliel or to direct followers or relatives etc. of Muhammad.
Does that apply to Chronicles, too?
Yes, that is so, because from time immemorial records of all kinds, including Chronicles, have always been made by personal interpretations of the writers, which is often still the case today, not only in the written recording of historical facts relating to annals and chronicles, but especially in information media, such as public media of all kinds. It also includes descriptions of observers and witnesses of any events and situations who, although they have made the same observations and perceptions of the exact same thing, make completely opposite and contrary statements. This results not only in false interpretations, but also in the withholding and concealment, misperception and misobservation, etc. of effective facts with regard to situations and events, etc., as well as serious falsifications of what has been heard.
Good, thank you. Then that's settled too. If you want to read this now, please,